So I'm going to talk about the TOEFL because it's very commonly used in intensive English programs. None of the other standardized tests are really applicable. And I'm going to speak specifically about how we used the TOEFL at Iowa State University. And we used it as an entrance exam similar to the ACT or the SAT except for language. And we used it in a couple different ways. They sent us their scores, and if their score was high enough, they moved straight on into the college. And if their scores were not high enough, then they came to our program and they worked more on their English. So we basically used the TOEFL as a language achievement. If they had done enough work on their English back in their home countries, then they didn't need to come into our program and to continue that work. However, the TOEFL was extremely problematic in a couple different ways. First, language doesn't work like fact-based information. It's a totally different animal, and it's hard to test in the same way that you test fact-based information. Also, at Iowa State University, we had a very large Chinese population who were very test-oriented. So the only requirement that they needed to get into the college was to get a high enough score on the TOEFL, which was problematic because it was hard to get the students to come to class. There wasn't really any need outside of legal requirements for them to come to class, but they didn't need to come to class to get into the college. All they needed was the test score. And so we would make the students come to class, but they weren't really interested in class, and I can't really blame them because like I said, all they needed was a test score. So it was problematic in a couple different ways. As I understand it, each school has its own score that they use as a gatekeeper to get into the college, and I'm not really clear on how they come up with that number. At Iowa State, we considered our number pretty low, and that caused a lot of anguish among the instructors. And so for the TOEFL, it's norm referenced because it's a very structured environment. The test is a really specific length of time. There are very particular rules about what you can bring, and it's all very standardized, to say it pretty plainly. However, we understood at the time that it's not really an effective test for language and for identifying other academic skills that students will need in the college. So we were moving away from the norm referenced testing to create our own original assessments that were more criterion based, related to our student outcomes and what we really thought that the students would need, not just language wise, but skills wise as well, for being an effective student in the college. At Iowa State, we really did not use the test scores for anything other than being a gatekeeper. However, we did use it somewhat as a placement. Well, we did use it as a placement test, and it was pretty relatively effective. The way that we used it we would place the students, and then we would come together as a department, and after a week or two of class, and we would discuss whether that placement was really accurate or not. So it's pretty reliable, although it's not really considered a valid indication of someone's language ability, and certainly not their academic ability. But it's pretty useful for ESL instructors and programs as a general placement, as long as that is supplemented with other types of identifying a student's language skill. Much of the TOEFL is selected response. It's multiple choice. There are 50 listening multiple choice questions, 40 multiple choice written expression questions, and 50 multiple choice reading questions. And then there is an essay. As I said previously, the TOEFL is a really poor indicator of not just a student's ability to function in an English-speaking world, but also their skills as a student, as a college student. So, as I also said, we were moving away from using the TOEFL and creating our own original assessments because we were very aware of how ineffective the TOEFL really was at indicating how prepared a student is for college success. So I'm afraid that my flowchart is pretty straightforward and kind of anticlimactic. We basically have two options when a student submits their TOEFL scores. They either move on directly to the university or they come to our program where they're taking classes. We use the TOEFL to place them initially, and they take their classes. They retake the TOEFL, and just as a quick side note, it's interesting that a lot of these students are overly optimistic about what their abilities are in English language speaking. So we see level 2 out of 6 retaking the TOEFL, hoping to get into college classes. But that's neither here nor there. So ultimately, they retake the TOEFL, and either they achieve the score that we're expecting or that they need to get into the university, or they continue taking classes. And this happens every semester. We gave the TOEFL, and it was up to them if they wanted to take it, or they could at the university, or they could take it other places as well. But then they resubmitted their scores. As I've said several times previously, the TOEFL is really not a good indicator of how well students are prepared, either academically or English language speaking wise. However, it does serve a little bit of a purpose as a placement test, but language itself is really not suited to be tested in the same way that facts are tested. And like I said, that's why we were moving more towards criteria-based assessments. And it also has caused quite a bit of problems, at least at Iowa State University, with student motivation and even likely leaving students really ill-prepared. Even though they may get a high enough score on the TOEFL, they may not be academically prepared for college classes.